welcome to the Kink Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. And everyone, happy 2026. This is the beginning of season 5, 5 years of doing the Kink Perspective for you all. It's been a journey, guys. So look, if you're new here, welcome. If you've been listening since the beginning, I'm still glad you're here. I'm glad for each one of you that sends stuff in, keeps this happening, keeps this moving forward. So do me a favor, no matter where you are at, make sure you like, subscribe if you're on YouTube. So you click the little bell so you get notified when new episodes drop. If you're on Spotify, on the app, rate this 5 stars so other people can find this content, find these conversations so they can have them, they can listen to them, they can get some benefit, hopefully, from them. And if you want to donate to the work, there is a link in the show's description. Every little bit helps, right? None of it's needed. All right. I've been thinking carefully about how I want to open this season because season 5 is going to sit closer to identity and power, attachment, and the things and the places, how they quietly collide inside of relationships and the lifestyle. This season, I promise, isn't going to be about explaining kink or teaching frameworks. We're going to get into naming patterns that people already live inside of, but rarely talk about, right? And there's one sentence that hasn't left me, and that's what we're going to talk about today. If I'm not needed, I don't exist. Now, most people don't think that, this is just some belief. People live this. It shows up how they stay, how they overfunction, how they're the reliable person, right? All of this looks responsible on its face. It often looks like they're, even loving, right? And this gets praised, of course, but underneath, there is something much quieter and much more precarious going on. And the idea that usefulness is the same thing as having self, right? That's not it. I've been hearing versions of this sentence everywhere lately. Fetlife, social media, fetish.com, TikTok, right? I don't subscribe to TikTok directly, but I see it through like YouTube, X, everywhere, right? And it's in the way people are talking about why they stayed in relationships that drained them, in the way that they describe their role rather than their desire, and how they, felt when they're no longer required, not because they're dramatic or dependent, but because being needed became the way they learned to stay connected to somebody. So this isn't about wanting to matter. Everybody wants to matter. We all do. This is about needing to be required in order to feel real in long-term partnerships and caregiving roles, in our kink and power dynamics where function quietly replaces our identity. So when being relied on becomes the proof that you exist, it becomes the only way you exist. And if being needed is the only place you feel solid, then being chosen feels dangerous. Choice means optional, and optional means you could be left. So being needed feels safer because it feels stable even when it costs you parts of yourself. So today, we're not fixing this. We're not going to be looking at steps, right? We're going to sit with this. We're going to name something that shapes how people attach, how they give power, how they stay, how they disappear inside of these roles that once felt meaningful. If I'm not needed, I don't exist. And that belief doesn't come from nowhere. And it never comes without a cost. So I want to start with first being needed as identity. Now, when being needed becomes central, it doesn't usually announce itself as a problem. It feels like a purpose. It feels like stability. It feels like being someone who matters in a way that can be measured. Function here starts to replace self very quietly. So you become the person who remembers things, you anticipate people's needs, right? You're the one who smooths over the tension and keeps the wheels turning, and you then also fill the gaps. And over time, that role stops being something you do and starts being who you are. And there's a particular kind of pride that comes with this. It's not the loud kind. It's really quiet. and it stays, right? And it tells you this, that things would fall apart without me. People rely on me. I'm solid. I'm dependable. I won't disappear when things get hard. That pride isn't fake, it's earned. But it becomes a trap because when usefulness becomes your proof of existence, you stop asking whether you're wanted. You only ask whether you're required. And those two things are not the same thing. Most people don't stay, or most say, I stayed because I was afraid. That doesn't match how they see themselves. It doesn't fit the story of being capable or loyal or even strong. So they say something that sounds better and feels better. I stayed because they needed me, because I was the one who could handle it. And, I didn't even want to abandon them. The language here matters. It turns fear into virtue, and it reframes survival as devotion. So when your identity is built around being needed, leaving doesn't feel like a neutral choice. It feels like a moral failure. So if you step away, something collapses, somebody's going to suffer. And you're no longer the good one, the steady person, the adult in the room. So you stay. And you tell yourself it's because you're committed or you're patient. And partially that's true. But often what's underneath is simpler and harder to admit. If I'm not doing this, I don't know who I am. And this shows up everywhere. Long-term relationships, when one person becomes the emotional regulator, in families where a child grows up early and never really comes back, right? Dynamics where a partner carries all the logistics and planning and labor and the repair, and even inside of our power exchange dynamics where being useful becomes the currency of worth. Now the problem isn't that being needed feels good, right? Of course it does. Being needed gives you shape to, your day. When I wake up and I've got emails and I know and people got questions and if I can help it, it's nice to feel needed. It gives you a role. It tells you where you belong. It gives you a reason to stay when things are uncomfortable. The problem is what gets crowded out. Desire gets quieter. Preference feels indulgent. Wanting something for yourself starts to feel selfish or destabilizing. You learn to orient around what's required instead of what's true for you. Now, over time, you stop checking in with yourself altogether. And this is why people often feel strangely empty when the relationship ends or their roles begin to change. They don't just lose the person or the dynamic, they lose the structure that told them who they were. And without that function, there's no mirror, there's no feedback loop. So they rush in again to be needed. They get into a new relationship, a new role, a new dynamic, anything that restores that familiar sense of being necessary. Because necessity feels safer than choice. Choice here implies uncertainty. It implies that someone could choose differently tomorrow. Being needed fixes that. It feels earned, it feels like proof, but it's also conditional in a way people rarely name. You exist as long as you perform, as long as you can function, as long as you can keep it together, right? That's a heavy way to live, even when it looks strong from the outside. Now, this isn't about blaming people for adapting this way. It's about recognizing how easily identity slides into function and how convincing the story becomes once it's in place. So, if being needed is how you learn to exist, then of course you protect that role. Of course you stay. The question isn't whether being needed has value. It does. We're not arguing that. The question is what happens to you when that's the only place you're allowed to exist? And where does this get learned? So when people hear something like, if I'm not needed, I don't exist, they often assume it comes from a dramatic moment, right? Something really obvious or a singular event. But the majority of the time, it doesn't start that way at all. It starts quietly, repetitively, and it's almost invisible because it starts in environments where attention followed usefulness, not cruelty, not chaos, just where you know, being easy made things smoother, right? Where being mature was noticed and rewarded. So you learn early that what works. You learn what keeps connection steady. And then guess what? You start to repeat it. Now, maybe you were praised for being responsible, for being the one who, didn't add stress, but that kind of praise lands differently when people, than most people recognize. It teaches you that closeness arrives after performance. Love doesn't disappear if you stop being useful, but it thins. It becomes less reliable, less warm, or even less present. So, guess what? You adjust. You get good at anticipating needs. You read rooms, you stay regulated even if you're not internally, right? You become dependable, low maintenance. This is not about blame. Even parents are human, families are human. And everybody does what inside of all of this, what we can to survive. But repetition teaches faster than intention ever could. So if every time you were helpful, you felt closer, safer, or seen, that usefulness becomes associated with survival. You don't think, right? I should earn love. You think this is how connection works. And once that association is in place, that goes the distance with you. It shows up in your friendships where you're the one who listens all the time, but no one listens to you. Relationships where you're doing all the organizing and managing and everything else, but no one's there for your emotional side, right? And even in the lifestyle where being calm gets rewarded, but if you have any sort of needs at all, it's going to feel disruptive. So over time, you stop experiencing this, as an adaptation and start experiencing this as your identity. I'm reliable, right? I'm steady, and I don't fall apart. That identity feels safer than being unstructured, safer than being unknown. This is why people struggle so much when they're no longer needed, not because they miss the work, but because the work was the bridge to that connection. And that's when the anxiety shows up, or the emptiness, or the urgency to find another place when you can be useful again. This pattern doesn't come from weakness, it comes from learning. So if being needed kept connection alive, of course it becomes your survival strategy, right? And you didn't choose it consciously. This is not something you just wanted. You're just repeating what works because it's safe. And it doesn't matter over time what it starts to cost you because this is what you know. And you don't question it because it doesn't feel like a belief. It just feels to you like reality, right? Like the rules of attachment itself. So when someone later asks you what you want or who you are outside of what you provide, the question can feel really strange, even threatening, right? Because if usefulness was the entry point to love, then stepping outside of that role feels like stepping outside of connection altogether. And once you see that, it becomes easier to understand why being needed feels non optional, right? So being chosen then becomes unstable, and letting go of the function can feel like letting go of yourself. Now, this isn't pathology here, it's a pattern. And I'm going to get into all that towards actually the end of the show because I need to kind of bring some other stuff up, but we'll get into that later. Look, patterns don't just disappear because we name them or see them, but naming them is how we stop running the whole show, right? We stop letting them take over and continue the repetition. As a matter of fact, I just experienced this yesterday with somebody, and they're struggling, but they're understanding, right? So let's talk about adult relationships for a minute, the upgrade that really isn't. All right. By the time the pattern shows up in adult relationships, it's going to feel like some sort of an upgrade, right? It's not survival. It's going to look to you like you're committed, like you're choosing to be a part of this, and you can be counted on, right? So in long-term partnerships, this often settles into the familiar shape. One person becomes stabilizer and the organizer and the emotional person, right? To keep things from tipping too far in either direction. Not because they were given this role, but because they're really just good at it and it works. So there's a real sense of relief in having a role like that. You know what's expected, you know where you fit, and you know how to stay connected, right? Caretaking starts to look like loyalty and endurance here for you starts to look like depth. So if you hold it all together, that looks like love. Now, none of that's fake, and that's not what I'm talking about, but it's functional and it's adaptive. It keeps relationships intact far longer than they would otherwise would be, but it also locks that pattern into place. Because once your value is in the relationship is tied to all of that, the idea of not doing that becomes unthinkable. So if you stop regulating, stuff might fall apart. If you stop caring, right, all the emotional load, somebody else might struggle. And then the biggest one, if you stop being needed, the connection itself feels at risk. So you don't frame what you're doing as fear, you frame it as commitment. You don't say, I'm scared of what happens if I step back. You say, I'm invested, I care, I'm loyal, and you mean it. And this is where the pride can grow, the quiet kind, right? The kind that says, I can handle this and I'm strong enough for the both of us, and I don't have to give up when things get uncomfortable. The pride becomes part of your identity, and it gets reinforced every time the relationship survives another gut punch, right? But right alongside that pride, something else starts to build resentment. It's not explosive kind, it's really subtle. It shows up even maybe as fatigue or being irritable, right? And you start to notice that as you're always the one adjusting, right? You're absorbing all the time and you feel proud of your capacity, but quietly you're getting angry because that's all you think that's required of you. So the real panic doesn't show up when things get hard. It shows up when things shift and when the other person becomes more independent, when they no longer rely on you in the same way, when your role starts to feel optional, right? And optionality here sounds healthy on paper. In practice, it's terrifying. Because if your place in the relationship has been secured by being needed, then being optional here feels like standing on thin ice. You start scanning for the signs. Are they pulling away? Right? A long time ago, I was, I'll give you a little personal insight into my life. I was reliant on somebody else because I had moved to a part of the country when I was living in the US. I didn't have a job yet. I came with whatever savings I had. And, I was struggling to kind of find work, but it was, I didn't know anybody in the town. And this other person was pretty much taking care of me, right? They took over the caregiving role. And eventually I got back on my feet, got everything going, got a good job, started moving forward. I took over the providing role. I started making more money. I was able to contribute. I felt good. I felt like I was bringing something back to the relationship. But the arguments started, and I couldn't figure it out. And this is what it was, because they felt at the time that they were the ones who were able to take care of and hold everything. That now that I had a job, I wasn't going to need them anymore. That they weren't wanted. And the relationship eventually fell apart because no matter what I did, it couldn't soothe this, right? So getting back to all of this, right? You can't fix problems that aren't yours, right? If you're staying, right, out of being a necessity, right, not because you're being controlled, that necessity becomes, starts to feel like safety. And this isn't the upgrade that isn't, right? This is the same attachment logic, just dressed up as adult devotion. The same strategy that once kept connection alive, now reinforced by the language of partnership or commitment or deep, you know, dynamic feeling. And people don't talk about this fear. They talk about it as responsibility. They even might call it love, but love that depends on constant usefulness is exhausting. It requires performance. And it doesn't even leave you any room to just be you. As a matter of fact, over time, you start to forget who you is because all you are is the person that's needed. And that's the bind. People being needed gives you structure and that stability, but it limits who you are allowed to become. So you exist most clearly when you're holding something together because that's the idea of being chosen rather than required. So that underneath all of this becomes unsettling. Choice introduces uncertainty. Choice doesn't guarantee permanence. Choice asks a different question altogether. And for someone whose identity has been built around being necessary, that question can feel far more threatening than staying exhausted and indispensable. And that's where this pattern tightens its grip, right in the place where devotion and self erasure start to look dangerously similar. Now, Chris, what does this all have to do with the lifestyle? Right? I'm glad you all asked. And I'm glad I've gotten a couple of questions about this because I've been mulling over a few different episodes, but this is the one because I've got about, I don't know, 6 or 8 emails on this, all varying questions. But the one underlying question that I almost see in every email is, how does this connect to us? How do I deal with this in my dynamic? Now, again, I'm not going to do the therapy stuff, but we're going to talk in the generalities here, right? This is the point where it becomes visible. Up until now, everything that we've been talking about here lives in plain sight in our relationships day to day. But power dynamics don't create these patterns, they expose them. And I tell you what, they're going to give them language. And that's where things can either become conscious or slide into something else. Being needed can feel like authority, right? Not in, dominance in the whole dramatic way, but steady, the kind that comes from being relied on. So when someone depends on you emotionally or practically, there's a sense of position that comes with that. You're central, you're relevant, right? And that can feel incredibly safe. And I see this in both dominants and submissives. Dependence often gets mistaken for stability. So if someone needs you, they're less likely to leave. They're definitely less likely to shift, right? There's predictability here. And that predictability calms people who've already learned that connection was fragile, right? So inside of power dynamics, this can look clean on the surface. Roles are defined, right? We have our expectations laid out, which we started going through our checklists, we're doing our negotiations, all of this, right? We know what we're bringing to the table. But maybe even a part of this will quiet some anxiety, and it definitely will answer the question of where you stand. But this is the part we have to slow down. Submission can get quietly tied to usefulness. Being good at serving or being reliable or emotionally available, right? That's fine. But worth becomes linked to performance rather than desire. And dominance, on the other side, can get tied to indispensability, being the center or the regulator or the person who keeps it all together. So authority here becomes less about choice and more about necessity. So what happens, right, when power exchange starts to slide into identity exchange? You're no longer choosing a role, you're providing your right to exist inside of it. And that shift matters. Choosing power feels different than a required function. Choosing power has flexibility. It allows us to negotiate and be curious and be desired and be erotic. Required function feels less rigid. It doesn't leave a whole lot of room to step back without fear that something's not going to collapse. And this is where people confuse safety with dependence, right? Safety is mutual. It holds even when there's a flex on the relationship, right? The barriers are being tested, is what I mean. Dependence feels solid, but only as long as everyone stays in their position. Now, again, none of this makes anyone wrong. These dynamics don't form because people are careless. They form because this is what works, because they can regulate it. It provides structure, right? But when being needed becomes the glue, power stops being relational and it starts being existential. The dynamic doesn't just give you connection, it gives you a sense of self. And that's where it gets fragile because if your authority or your submission or your place in the structure is the thing that tells you who you are, then any shift to that is threatening, right? All of a sudden, new negotiations come in, we're revisiting them, new kinks, whatever, that can destabilize somebody. Any independence is going to feel risky. So you don't just risk losing the dynamic, you risk losing who you are. And this is why some people feel panicked when their partner grows or shifts in a new direction. They go back to school, they get a promotion, whatever the case may be, right? This is why people overfunction inside of the dynamics that were meant to be mutual. And this is exactly why power that was once, you know, in living starts to feel heavy. Not because power is a problem, but because identity got welded into its function. And when power is chosen, it can be playful and deeply connecting. But when power is required in order to feel real, it becomes brittle. It has to be maintained or preserved. And that's not intimacy. That's survival dressed up as structure. And the important distinction here isn't between healthy and unhealthy kink, right? It's between power that you step into and power that you cling to because it's the only place you feel solid. One of these things allows movement, and the other demands performance. And once you can see that distinction, it becomes harder to ignore how often being needed has quietly stood for being known. That's the crossover, not into kink, but into clarity, because power doesn't create these dynamics. It simply reveals what wasn't, what was already there, waiting for a place to take shape. All right. So, what's this whole threat of being chosen instead? Being chosen sounds like the thing everybody wants, right? We've read about it in books and romance novels. We see it in Disney stories and all these things. We see it in the rom-coms. I choose you. And they travel to the other side of the high school quad or across the ocean to find their loves, right? On the surface, it feels romantic. And as a matter of fact, we grow up having that reinforced and shoved in our face at almost every TV show, book, or anything else we get involved with, or our friend's cousin's third, boyfriend who's an ex-mechanic down the road's neighbor. That's how they did it. We hear these stories and then we just get sucked into them. I see this. I want to kneel. I want to serve. I want to dominate. I want to do all of these things. But the fantasies don't match the reality, right? But for people whose identity has been built around being needed, being chosen just feels dangerous because I come back to this word. It feels like you're an option, and if you're an option, that means somebody else can choose something different tomorrow. It doesn't. It really means the connection exists because of desire, not necessity, and desire is harder for people to control because desire can shift. It can change. So being needed feels different. Needed feels predictable. If someone depends on you, they're less likely to leave, right? Need creates gravity, keeps people in place. So when someone offers choice instead of reliance, it can quietly activate fear rather than relief. You see this when your partner says, I don't need you to do all of this. Instead of feeling appreciated, something gets, agitated. When someone becomes more self sufficient and the relationship feels less stable instead of more secure, right? That's when things start to shift. Choice asks a different question, not what you provide, but who you are. Not whether you're useful, but whether you're desired without obligation. And that question can feel exposed. And I recently encountered this with somebody in the last couple of weeks where they were, talking to me about something. And, I'm sitting there listening and they'd rather feel needed than feel chosen because being chosen means that person can leave because they can choose something else. So people protect necessity. Sometimes they don't even know they're doing it, right? And if they stay indispensable, right, they're going to be kept around. Not because they want the control, but because control feels safer than uncertainty. And sometimes they subtly undermine even choice. They stay busy. People will don't let themselves be seen without a role. They make it hard for the other person to meet them without needing something from them. Because if you're needed, you don't have to wonder why somebody stays. If you're chosen, you do. And that wondering can feel intolerable if your sense of self has always been anchored in function. And this is why people feel more anxious in stable mutual relationships than they ever did in imbalanced ones. Stability removes the familiar proof. It asks for you to be present instead of performance, right? You're not being told to go out and do something. Being chosen means you can be left, even if you didn't do anything wrong. But being needed tells you exactly why you're there. So people often mistake predictability for safety, and they choose structure that guarantees their place, even if it costs them their intimacy. And I wrote a status message today that obviously upset a lot of people, right? It wasn't because I'm sitting here trying to anger people or upset people, but the reality of what I said doesn't mean that it's not true. And all I said was people who keep choosing bad partners often look for someone steady to lean on between the racks, right? Because what I'm doing is I'm naming the pattern. I'm talking about the next stage of all of this where they are so unstable they need to get recalibrated to then go back out. They're not looking for the person who's stable that's going to help anchor them. What they're doing is they just need to restabilize, right? So they take their help, they get their footing back, but then they go out and make the same bad choice again, right? So at some point, the person who is stable or their anchor, right, notices it and names that pattern. And this is where they just stop doing it. They stop helping. And the other person who is constantly doing this starts to spiral, right? All of this, right? By the way, this isn't a conscious sabotage here. It's a nervous system choosing what it knows. But like I said, it's going to come with a cost because being chosen is the only place where you're wanted for who you are, not how you hold it together. And if you never let yourself live there, you never really find out whether you're enough without the role you're projecting. That's not a threat, it's exposure. And being chosen asks you to exist without armor or obligation or proof. And for someone who learned to survive by being necessary, that can feel far more frightening than staying indispensable and quietly, exhausted. That's why this moment matters, because the fear isn't about losing the relationship. It's about losing the only way you've ever known how to exist inside of one. A while ago, I watched this thing and it was wonderful. It was two people sitting on a table and they said, "Who are you? Tell me who you are. No labels. Describe to me who you are without a label." And I watched this woman ask this man, and he struggled. He struggled because he couldn't figure out outside of this who he was if he couldn't name what he could do. Because he started naming things. He's like, but that's something you're bringing to the table. That's not who you are. Are you a kind person? Are you compassionate? You know, she asked, "What do you do for fun when you're on your own?" And it was always something geared towards the partner, not geared towards himself. But because he had done this for so long, he no longer had a sense of his own identity. So there is a cost of existing this way. Living this way takes a toll. And even when nothing starts to look wrong, most people don't even notice it all at once, right? It shows up more often in being tired than you think of anything else, right? And it's not exhausted in a dramatic way. It's just you're really never running at 100%, right? Because the more you carry, the more you know you're going to start noticing things that others are missing. You want to handle all those needs for them because you do it and you've done it before, but that constant being ready to perform, even if it's natural feeling to you, starts to wear you down. And that's the slower part here. This is the identity piece here. Because when so much of your value comes from being useful, it gets hard to answer a simple question about yourself. What do you want? What do you feel like doing? What actually matters to you outside of what needs attention? So without a role, things completely feel vague, unstructured, almost uncomfortable. And a lot of people notice it when there is a space. If they've got any free time, they don't like to relax, right? They feel restless or flat. It's not peace. Even asking them to sit for 10 minutes isn't easy. And by the way, desire changes too. Wanting things starts to feel secondary, right? Pleasure is going to get dulled down, not gone, it's just less accessible. And the anger can show up here because this is where people get confused. They feel irritated or resentful, but they're not really sure why. And it's not like anyone forced it on them. There's there's no one demand all of this explicit need, but the anger starts to feel misplaced, and then it starts leaking out sideways. Pardon me, sideways. Underneath all of that is a specific kind of loneliness. You're connected to someone, but no one can meet who you are. They can rely on you, they appreciate all the things, and they count on you, but no one sees you. They know how you do stuff, but they don't know anything about you. And that kind of loneliness is hard to name because from the outside, your life looks full because you're important or you're needed. But inside, there's a sense of being slightly absent from your own life, like you're present everywhere except where you are. And this is the cost of existing primarily as what you can provide. And you keep doing it because then you feel you're going to be relevant or you're needed. But you pay for it with fatigue, dullness, loss of your desires, anger, resentment, all these things. And for a lot of people, that, you know, latter part of wanting to figure out who they are really never comes. As I'm going to end this without trying to tie it all together here, because I'm hoping that you all are starting to see what I'm talking about. You all every time I got asked the other day. Actually, I got a really nice comment the other day, and someone said, I read a lot of your early stuff, and I listened to your a lot of early shows, and I've seen where you've evolved to. In the beginning, when I started this show and I started writing, I was really clinical, right? I used a lot of heavy jargon, but I'm going to be honest with you. Why have I stopped doing that? Because the reality is, when I've been to therapy myself, that stuff flew right over my head, right? Long before I went back to school and got my second master's. Um, it just flew. I didn't understand what they were talking about. I didn't get what they meant. It just sounded like a lot of big words, and sometimes it left me feeling stupid. So then I'd have to go home, look it up, and I'm like, why didn't you just say it this way? So that's why I say these things this way, because I want you all to relate. I want you to feel this inside of you so you have the language to start naming these things. Not because this is some sort of hidden text. This isn't the Hammurabi code, right? That I'm trying to impart onto the world. It's there. You just have to make sense of it. And if I say it to you this way, you're going to make sense of it, right? Ah, look, everything we talked about today ends at the same point. How much of your sense of self is organized around being useful? And how the connections you have is only being maintained by staying necessary or needed, and how that makes you feel, right? And more so, how familiar it is, no matter how tired you get. There's nothing I want you to do with all this right now. I'm not asking you all to go out and start making changes. This isn't therapy I'm doing, right? I'm not implying any insights. I'm giving you the capability and the language to start understanding what's going on. Because what I have done and the direction for 2026 is I'm going to try to do something new, right? That's why you all show up. So I want to leave you, the one thing I'm not going to change, I'm going to leave you all with a question that you still all don't answer. I know quietly you think about because I get a couple of emails, but Chris is making a requirement to you all. If I don't get comments on my questions, I'm going to stop asking you guys questions here at the end. I'm not going to give you anything more to think about and reflect on. Because to be honest with you, it takes a lot of my time. And I want to see that it's making an impact. I want to see, I don't care if you're making comments on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, Fetlife, on my Instagram. I want to know, even emails. But there's over 4,500 alone, or I'm sorry, more than 5,500 of you alone on Spotify that listen to this. I'm asking for 20 of you to talk about it. I know it's not easy. I know it's not, because it's going to feel like you're being, I'm hitting a nerve. Chris, you're hitting a nerve. Why are you asking me to? Because exposing it can be the doorway to back to yourself, right? So here's the question. If I stopped being needed tomorrow, what would still be left of you? I know that kind of sounded odd because I framed it in the me, then I asked it in the second. So I'll ask you again. If you stopped being needed tomorrow, what would still be left of you? And I'm not asking what's falling apart or who's going to struggle or what wouldn't get done. I just want you to notice that what starts to come up when you ask that question, that's enough. All right. All right. Couple things. Yes, I have a book out there, Tangled Desires, the intersection between psychology and BDSM. You can get it wherever your ebooks, so there is a print version of it. All right. It's a good book. It's my first book. Struggled, a little clinical, a little repetitive. I'm fine with that. Yes, I am. It's official. I have started. I spent some time over the holidays while I was still working with veterans. I have mapped out a little structure. It's a pre-structure outline, right? Before I get to the outline, and then before I start writing, I've got a pre-structure for a new book. So there is something coming, right? This is going to be heavily diving into the lifestyle. About it's going to go into identity, right? Um, I don't know where it's going to go yet, but we're going to get it there. That's number one. Number two, a couple of other things. You're famous now. Second time that season 5, second time we're making this appearance, and it's probably going to keep carrying forward. All right. So when I came back after my little bit of a break and I started writing again, I've noticed something, and I'm going to repeat this very clearly. I am not going to explain anymore what I write. What I write or what I say is what I write or what I say. That's it. Now, if you're confused about something, hey, I read this. Could you explain? Absolutely. I'm happy to do that. If you show up and you start saying, and this is how I explained it to this person, I said, you came here and I was talking about apples and you started talking about boats. And you want to make this whole article about boats, which has nothing to do with what I'm talking about apples. Nothing. And this happened this past week. To the point that this person started talking about billing and insurance. Nothing of that. All right. I was taught what I had said was your partner is not your therapist. I had this very discussion in season 1. I think it's episode 36. I don't even remember. It was a little stiff, but your partner is not your therapist. It's not why they're there. So this time I did a writing, and this triggered a few people. It's not triggering in the way that, like, oh my God, Chris, you upset them. You should, because I don't offer that. That's if you read something and you're struggling with it, you need to go and talk to somebody about that. That's not People aren't going to change how they write just because you have feelings about it. But what this did was expose some cracks, and this person started derailing what I said, started attacking what I said, started arguing with others. That's it. I'm done. I'm done. So there is somebody that I like, and I don't really follow their work, but I respected them a few years ago. And I never understood why they just stopped engaging with people and they started blocking, but I get it now. So the reality is, I write what I write and I say what I say. I will explain it if you're confused. But if you come in, and I'll even, that's fine. I'm fine with the disagreement as long as it's civil. You start attacking me, you make it personal, you're going to get blocked. You're at the very least, your comment's going to get deleted. But I'm not doing this anymore. You don't understand the toll it takes on me. I do all of this for free. My show, the worksheets that I provide, right? The classes that I teach, I don't charge for any of that. So if you start attacking me because you're basically ungrateful, you're done. No more access, no more access to me. You can go make another account and follow me. I don't really care. But I'm not doing that anymore. And that's not unreasonable. That's me setting a boundary. And I talk about boundaries a lot, right? So that's for, I can't even remember. We're just going to call her Starry Eyed Surprise because, this person just lost their lunch. To another comment that followed up with an email. I liked what you said, but you're making, again, sweeping generalizations, and that doesn't fit for everybody. That's fine. People, again, taking what I wrote, and I wasn't talking about people. I was talking about a pattern, right? And Karen here actually wasn't even a Karen, was more about, I don't know, we'll call it crying eyes, was more about, oh, it's derailing into something. It's not. I'm naming a pattern. And I have to, people don't really understand. I can't sit here and tell you every psychological tidbit. I'm not allowed. Sorry. If you want to do that, go find a therapist and sit in private with them, work with me or not. But don't criticize me because I can't give you all the information on the planet. You don't realize what limitations I'm under. And I take those limitations seriously. However, it's going to be enough of all of that. All right. I hope you all had a very happy holiday season. I hope it was restful. Spend some time with friends and family. I know the world's in chaos right now. I know it is, right? But we have to start figuring out ways that we can find common bonds between each other rather than looking at it as every person as our enemy. I don't really care who you are. I don't. But if we keep doing all of that stuff, then it's just going to be problematic, right? Now, I gave you my question. I want 20 responses at the very least. I'm only going to ask if I don't get any responses or I don't meet the quota, right? What's going to happen is I'm only going to do two more questions in the next two episodes. And if those fail the threshold, I'm going to stop. Right? Because I think about these questions for you all because I want you to have something at the end after you sit there with your dominant, you maybe sit there with your dom and listen to the show because I get these emails, or there's a couple of you in a submissive group. Like I think one's in the UK. My new people from Iceland. Hello, Reykjavik again. Thank you. I'm glad it helps. But let me know, like these help me shape new questions for you all with your feedback. It's a loop. I need it, guys. I need it. Right? I need the comments. They drive how I think. Right? Last night I sat around and I was thinking about some other stuff. And as I was working it all out, I have 3 new writings that are going to develop and another and probably next week's show. Right? I am going to try to get Hi There Catsuit on probably in the next couple of weeks. I'm going to do my best. I'm going to coordinate with him. There's a lot to talk about. We're going to go a little bit retro, a little old school BDSM. Now, I did talk to you all very quickly. I want to address this. Last year, at the end of the show, at the end of the year, there was going to be a forensic psychologist. I worked tirelessly with her. Unfortunately, our schedules, I'm just going to leave it at our schedules didn't align. That's it. That's all I'm going to really say. It's a shame, but I don't chase people. So I make an offer, you accept, you don't accept. All right. Um, yeah. Other than that, you know, let me know your thoughts and comments today. Right. This is a big topic, and I know it's one that affects a lot of us. I'm not even going to lie to you all. It's affected me. I've been there. Right. 20 people in the comments. Until next time, everybody, be safe, stay kinky.